Epic finishes to the 2024 fantasy football regular season and what comes next in the fantasy playoffs. That's what we're talking about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find the newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. So we're going to kick off with a fun little story, but also want to talk about it's the end of week 14. We wrapped up the regular season. We've been talking about this as a weird year for most of the year. Very healthy year. A lot of people scored a lot of points in their leagues. I mean, like a lot of teams scored. Players scored. All the players stayed healthy. I had a subscriber reach out, and he just barely missed the playoffs and kind of want to talk through some of those things. And I was kind of thinking about his team, and he had some of the hits, and he was excited about some of the players. Got on some of the fun late round running backs like a Bucky Irving and Tyrone Tracy, and had some other good hits. Was kind of lamenting that he didn't get onto like Brock Bowers, but he barely missed the playoffs. And one of the things I said back to him was like, well, part of it is like this structure I think really would have worked, and this team could have really worked in a lot of other seasons. But in this year, the teams that outscored you just stayed really healthy and they outscored you. You know what I mean? It's just one of those things where sometimes the other teams beat you. We have some really fun teams, Shawn, where we finished like third and didn't advance in some of the best ball stuff. And I'm looking at the teams ahead of us, and it's like, well, yeah, I mean, there's two really good teams here. Like we were just talking about the number one team was a Barkley Chase start. And it's like, okay, well, that team had a really good team. And so there's only two teams out of 12 advancing out of, your draft, and you finished third and you have a really good team as well, but there are a lot of other good teams. And so I think that is something that, we'll unpack a lot of that stuff. That is something that I just wanted to start as sort of a headline that I do think some people are missing in terms of like feeling like they didn't do well enough or trying to self-analyze or like where they failed or where they came up short. The margins were a little thinner this year. Like I know my best ball portfolio, my advance rate's a little bit below average. I also had Rashee Rice and Stephon Diggs as two of my highest rostered players, as well as some structural issues and some other concerns. But I mean, when you get hit by two of the bigger injuries, a lot of those teams are going to struggle. You're not going to finish top two in advance in your best ball leagues with key injuries this year. There's going to be other healthy teams among the other 11 when you look at the way this year played out. There's a lot of things like that to analyze about 2024, what it all meant. I'm really just burying the lead, though, Shawn. We had a really, really fun sweat in an FFPC team. It wasn't the end of the regular season for us over at FFPC because for anyone who doesn't know their format in the main event in the Fantasy Pros Championship, it's a 12-week regular season. The top two teams in each division advance immediately to the sprint portion, where from weeks 15 to 17, it's a total point format for 3 weeks, plus also your average of your regular season, your average weekly score. So that comes into play too. There's 4 components. And then eventually there will be an overall champion at the end of that. The overall prize is $1 million this year. There will be about 800 people that advance to that sprint portion. I believe the number was the last I checked. Maybe it's even more. But it's 2 from each league automatically after week 12. But weeks 13 and 14 are the league playoffs for your 12-team league. It's a 4-man playoff or 4-person playoff. The 1 and 2 seeds are obviously in that. They've already earned their auto bids. The 3 and 4 seeds are in that as well. They at least advance to the league playoff. And if they win the league playoff, if they win both in weeks 13 and 14, they also can earn sort of a wild card bid into that sprint portion in weeks 15 to 17. So we've talked about this a little bit on the show recently. We had a team that did not earn the auto bid because we played the wrong quarterback of 4 quarterbacks that we're carrying. I also got a question about that. And so that's why I'm kind of explaining the ins and outs of FFPC, that we've talked about this 4 quarterback team, Shawn. The reason we're carrying 4 is we can't make any more moves through the sprint portion. We have 3 upcoming matchups, and it's this total points element. And so it's not a typical single QB league like you might be playing in your home league where you're not going to carry 4 quarterbacks. We're carrying 4 because we have different scenarios where we may want to go to a contrarian play later in the sprint portion. A lot of different things may happen.
We're only carrying 4 because we have Tank Dell. And that means that we haven't been willing to cut CJ Stroud, even though CJ Stroud is maybe the most disappointing thing of the 2024 season. But there might be a scenario where in the final week things are close enough that a Dell Stroud combo
Against the
would be
Ravens.
against the Ravens would be the clearest path. But I kind of hope that's not the case because I don't want to be playing for $1 million
Right.
and play those two guys. They have been
So that's why we have 4. We
immensely.
have
The other reason we have 4 is that 3 of them had week 14 buys,
Yeah.
and you need to start someone who can score some points for you in the championship game. And so Tua might have been someone who was cut a month ago, if not for looking forward to that. And then Ben, in the last month, he has caught fire in part because they can't run the ball down by the goal line. And so, sometimes you perhaps back into a really good situation. I mean, Tua will now be in the mix. But the other reason that we have so many quarterbacks, and this is not really unique for me to this particular team, is because of the health of players.
Yeah.
And because you combine the health and the fact that so many of these teams we drafted essentially all hits. And that has opened up roster spots that in most years wouldn't be there because you would not hit on as high a percentage of your draft picks. And then even the guys you hit on would not have stayed healthy. So you would have to have stashed a lot more contingent plays. And that also hasn't been as much the way 2024 has worked. What you've needed in 2024, especially if you don't have Lamar Jackson or Josh Allen or Jalen Hurts or Joe Burrow, is you need to be able to actually match up some and play the quarterback who gives you the best chance that week because you still need to score quarterback points.
Yep. That's really well put. So, yeah, I mean, our roster's locked, no more waiver moves before week 14. And what I was describing is this team, we've talked about it on the show, we played the wrong quarterback each of weeks 11 and 12, the final couple weeks of the regular season, and did not earn the auto bid as a result by a few points, whatever it was, 7 points over the course of the whole season or something. The number 1 seed is on win-loss. The number 2 seed goes to the next highest total point team. We were right there competing for that number 2 seed. Instead, we got the number 3 seed, I think, on win-loss. Because we also had a path to the 1 seed on win-loss, but we didn't quite get
swept
there.
And instead we did neither.
We very well could have won both. So then we had to win both games. We had the 240-point game in the semifinal. I think we talked about it a little bit last week. It was the highest score either of us has ever had on for FFPC or
I can't believe we mentioned that we scored 240.
You can't believe that we mentioned it?
That it probably didn't come up on the show.
It probably didn't come up at all. And so this week, we had to win again, or else this team was going to be done. It doesn't move on to the sprint. You could theoretically win a little bit of money in the consolation tournament, but you're usually not necessarily tracking those types of things. And so this team now, it needed to win its league championship in week 14 to advance. And so again, it gets back to that 4 QB question. Our QBs are Stroud, week 14 bye, Anthony Richardson, and Drake May, who are 2 others that we've added. We also added Tua. It was a Stroud team, but we've added 3 other quarterbacks that have some upside for various reasons.
Every time someone got hurt, just throw them onto the back of the roster.
Right. So both those guys, Richardson and May, also on bye. We needed 2 and 14 is what you were describing, and we can't go drop Tua now. So we needed Tua to get into the sprint. We're really kind of looking at Richardson and May is probably our cleaner paths to QB points, although maybe Tua as well, the way that he's been scoring. And then Stroud as this back pocket potential stack to pull out in week 17 with Dell, that not a lot of people are going to have Stroud teams in the shootout portion. So that's all very fun. And
if they do, they'll probably just decide to play someone like Will Levis instead because CJ Stroud has been really, really bad. But how did it start for us on Thursday night?
Yeah, so we have this team that we're really excited about, scored all these points, has the potential to be the overall champion and win $1 million if it can score 240 in week 13. Week 14 started with Jaden Reed scoring 0 and Josh Jacobs scoring 3 touchdowns on our opponent's roster, and we were down 24-0. I mean, luckily Jacobs didn't do anything but 60 rushing yards, no receptions, nothing else, but still 24 points on those 3 touchdowns. We still have the stronger roster, and so we go into Sunday with a pretty irrational hope and optimism. I think you were probably more optimistic than me, as you typically are.
Well, Ben, we had someone who's going to go score 40 points. So that seems like you can come back pretty fast.
Right. So at the back end of everything, we're talking through it. We're sharing notes on the rooting interests and when players play. We have Jamar Chase, and neither roster has a Sunday Night
Ben,
Football player or
Ben,
another Monday. What's
I mean, Jamar Chase is capable of more,
yeah.
but I mean, we had Jordan Addison. So what was the concern?
Well, we had Jordan Addison on the bench because our team is too good. Our team is
So do we
pretty
play
loaded.
a player who scored 0 and have a guy with 39 points on the bench? Is that how it worked out?
We played a team that scored 0 and had a guy with 39 points on the bench. We also had Jameson Wilson on the bench. We had Sincere McCormick is an ad that we've had on this team on the bench. We had Bucky Irving in the lineup. He hardly plays. I'm sure he hurt some of our listeners' lineups as well. We had Brock Bowers on this team. He doesn't have a very good game. As I'm watching through the morning games, it feels like our opponent's team is scoring a lot of touchdowns, kind of like the Thursday night game with Josh Jacobs. They get a TD from Najee Harris. They get a late game TD from Aaron Jones in a game that was a Sam Darnold 5 TD pass TD game. Aaron Jones, more or less, quote unquote, deserved to have a low scoring game, but he gets this late touchdown that's sort of meaningless. Najee Harris gets a TD in a game in our opponent's lineup where Jaylen Warren is the way more effective back and is taking over, a lot of work as the game's going along, but Harris gets the short yardage and gets the TD. And I'm sitting here like, I mean, every guy that this guy has is scoring, except he did have Saquon Barkley, and Saquon Barkley has what for him is basically a floor game, 124 rushing yards and a 2-point conversion, but doesn't get in on several green zone opportunities, doesn't catch any passes, doesn't have the monster game that we know he can have. So we go into the afternoon, even though Bucky didn't do great and Brock Bowers didn't do great. We did get a Jerry Jeudy touchdown in the morning and a nice game from him. And we had Tua, and Tua had a nice morning as well, especially, late in that game. It was good that he got a couple pass TDs. And so we're like in range where we're like, okay, going into the afternoon, we have 2 players. They have 1 player and a kicker, and that's it for them. And we have Jamar Chase behind that. And so as long as we needed to claw back a little bit, but as long as we clawed back a little bit, we would be in good condition for Jamar Chase. The players we had were Trey McBride and Kyron Williams. I felt really good about that. They both have really good games. They did not outscore the one player on the other side because that player was Puka Nacua. And so watching that Rams game in the afternoon was very frustrating between Nacua, and then they had Tyler Bass as their kicker. He didn't kick any field goals, which was nice, but Nacua scored so much. Kyron's trying to keep up, really, and I'm like hoping Kyron keeps scoring touchdowns because that's the only way he can really keep up with everything Nacua is doing. Nacua ends up going absolutely bonkers, scoring 40 plus. Kyron was around 20. McBride and tight end premium had 17, I think, in the end. He didn't catch any passes in the whole first half, but gets going in the second half a little. So we do get like 37 from our 2 guys ish, but he gets 41 from Puka, plus 6 from the kicker. We actually lose about 10 points in the afternoon. And I'm pretty frustrated. I ended up sending you a message on Monday and was like, man, this sucks. Not looking good. We are down 37.5. And even though like Bucky got banged up and some of these other things didn't go well, and I felt like they were getting all the fortunate TDs, and a lot of our players weren't scoring touchdowns. Bowers didn't score. McBride didn't score. A lot of the guys in our lineup aren't actually scoring touchdowns. I thought we had this path to where Jamar Chase could have won it with a 20-point game or a 25-point game. And instead, we're not going to win because we need 37.5 points from Jamar Chase.
We did. I don't know if you're aware of this, Ben. He had scored 40 twice earlier in the season. When Colin Kelly and I recorded OT on Monday morning, we were up 26 with Chase Brown to play, but facing Jamar Chase. And Colin was terrified. Terrified. My prediction was 20 for Chase, 40 for Chase Brown, 40 for Jamar Chase, and both teams win. And there were definitely some nightmare scenarios where you thread the needle and both teams lose. But they're playing against the Dallas Cowboys. You're expecting this to be the most fun games for fantasy football. Viewers, players, what have you. And right from the beginning, it seemed like Chase was going to do it. He gets a flurry of targets early. T. Higgins is not involved. You get the early touchdown. I was telling you that I was sort of fast forwarding through the game. Sometimes you come back from a timeout, you're barely forward. I see Chase Brown in the Salvation Army red bucket there, and he's exclaiming because he knows he just scored a touchdown, but has not been ruled as a touchdown. That's going to go down, I think, Ben, as the most important replay of my fantasy life, because I'm thinking if Brown gets in there, then both things are going to happen. Brown's going to score enough to shield us in OT, and Jamar Chase is going to do it. You get to the half, and you're thinking, this is going to happen. The second half started a little bit more slowly.
It's so funny too, because I mean, this is I talk about this on the show all the time. It's why I love doing the show with you. You bring out a more optimistic side of me, because you see that Chase Brown touchdown in the first half and think the path is open now and it's going to happen. Both of these things are going to happen. I'm going to thread the needle. You mentioned to me as well that you were also playing against both Puka and Jamar Chase on your other team with your sister and managed to survive that as well. So you had won 3 games that could main events that could win in advance. You managed to advance one with a Jamar Chase in the lineup with needing all of his points, and also advance the other 2 that were against Jamar Chase, which is a real needle to thread.
Well, then,
fantastic.
At one point, it looked like the 2 teams that started Will Levis, which again, I mean, that's the beauty of week 14 buys, right? Because I don't know there's ever been a quarterback that a team was going to start for more than a year where I have been as adamant the Will Levis is just simply nowhere close to being a viable NFL starter. And yet I'm starting him on the 2 must-win teams, and then you and I are playing against him.
Yeah, that was hilarious because Russell Wilson was in our opponent's lineup, and then Pickens got deactivated, and he made the switch, and I noticed it, and I messaged you right before the game started. He took Russell Wilson out. He put Will Levis in, Sean, and you go, oh, that's not great because I have Levis in both of my other 2 must-win games. And my immediate thought was, why are you starting Will Levis in both of your other 2 must-win games? At the same time, Sean, I took the over in that game over at Stealing Lines. I thought that would be a fun game. The last week, Mac Jones had thrown a ton of air yards. I thought the Jags might air it out against a Titans rush defense that's decent. The Titans came out and ran 8 straight plays to start this game and set the tone for basically both teams that, like, this is going to be a low-scoring game. And then both teams were like, okay, well, fine. We'll just run the ball and punt. We'll run the ball and punt. It was 6-0 after 3 quarters. The over was not the right play.
It wasn't. It did illustrate, again, the highs and lows that you're going to sometimes get with the quarterbacks who are like Will Levis, who is really an ultra poor man's version of Anthony Richardson, where, I mean, he's going to throw the ball deep some, right? Somehow Nick Westbrook-Akine is the stat that like Colin brought to me a week ago that I was like, I think you're in some parallel universe. This can't be true. But that dude has like 8 receiving touchdowns.
Yeah. On 20 catches or something like that.
Yeah. So there are scenarios where a quarterback like Will Levis, who is extremely athletic, has a big-ish arm, no ability to control the pocket, no ability to read the defense, no ability to throw accurately. Those are 3 pretty important components of being an NFL player, quarterback. But you're going to get the sling it and score points occasionally. And certainly if you're not having to start him, you're playing him in best ball. I mean, maybe that works a little bit. In any individual game, you create a lot of exposure to horrific QB play. There were the potential for 2 touchdowns. He misses Westbrook-Akine late, and he also fails to make one of those twirling 2-handed high point catches that we have seen just over and over from a Justin Jefferson. Certainly got several remarkable catches. One of the things about the Puka game, often when you're playing against someone who is good, and certainly I think our opponent, and I also want to say that as excited as I was, my heart did go out to our opponent a little bit because
for sure.
their experience Sunday night is that I made it And then you're living through Monday thinking the only way I don't win is if some incredible long shot happens. And then you're watching the game and it's a horrible experience. And then in the end, you lose and it's a horrible experience. So
They
being on
were
the other side of that is really rough.
Yeah, they were the 4 seed, we were the 3 seed. We beat respectively the 1 and 2 seed. So in our league, the winner of our matchup would get the third bid into that shootout that I was talking about. In other leagues, you're playing the 1 or the 2 seed in the championship, and if they win, they're already in. And so it's a difference. There's also a financial incentive to finishing first or second. But to your point, this individual, so the opposite side of us, they needed to win for their team to continue to play, and they were probably having a hard time.
But you're watching that game with Puka, and I think you're watching the game with Jamar Chase, and you're thinking, well, Jamar Chase is really good. The fact that you have the underneath component, the run after the catch component, the vertical component, he's uncoverable, which leads to some of this soft coverage where you're just racking up all these catches where you're like, he's not even doing anything. Puka Nacua was doing some stuff. I mean, there were some plays where you're just screaming at the Bills defense to understand, number one, to play defense, and number two, to understand what the Rams are doing. They give him some run underneath on occasion. They let him essentially score back-to-back rushing touchdowns after a timeout in between. But he also made some sideline grabs where you will simply not see a defensive back have a receiver pinned at the sideline and blanket coverage, and Matthew Stafford somehow puts a ball in a spot where only Nacua can go up and get it, but shouldn't be able to. And he did multiple times. So if Levis gets that kind of catch in the end zone, then he scores at least one, maybe 2 touchdowns. The other chance he had 2 guys been running free out to his left on 4th down, and decided to throw an inaccurate pass to the guy who was covered. I think an inaccurate pass to the guy who's uncovered probably would have still worked.
He got asked about that. Why didn't you throw to Okonkwo on that play? Because he threw it to a tight end who was guarded in the back of the end zone. Okonkwo was kind of running to the front pylon open underneath that throw on the same side of the field. And his response was that he didn't see it. And it's kind of like, I mean, you got to have real tunnel vision because you're looking to the side of the field. Then there's another receiver that's further that way toward the sideline. But how do you not pick up that guy that's unguarded over there? But yeah, he threw to the guy that was guarded.
And, in Will Levis's defense, I love the fact that he just says, I didn't see him, even though it's going to look bad. I love how Levis competes. I mean, I was excited to watch him play in this game because the Jaguars' defense is awful. You're going in and you're thinking, I mean, he could put up 25, 30 points. That isn't what happened.
He's a really easy guy to root for. I agree with that. I think he rolls with things. He had a really great quote earlier this year. We may have talked about on the show, or maybe I wrote it in Signals. I can't remember at this point, but they asked him if he thought he played better when he had his first kind of good game, I think against the Texans. And he said, well, I didn't throw a chest pass or underhand it. So yeah, that's a very self-aware statement. I really like that.
And again, with the quarterback situation there, it was very similar to the one that you and I have, where again, we probably should have simply cut CJ Stroud, but we have Stroud, we have Jaden Daniels, we have Drake May. They're all on the bye. And so it was just the previous week that we had picked up Will Levis specifically to play in week 14. And this is a Nico Collins team. So you're thinking, how are you ever going to, play CJ Stroud? But there's that slight chance that, a Stroud Collins play might be the right play at the end. And you're continually trying to look for more information, which is one of the things I've tried to emphasize over the last couple of weeks on different shows and writing and all of that, is continue to gather information. We've got more information now on Tua. That may end up being, very important and profitable to us. You don't think that you're going to bench Jaden Daniels, but injuries are always possible. We continue to gather more information on Drake May, and it looks very good. He might be a guy who would have to go in there and might be able to get the job done, put up some huge fantasy scores. You think back to our lineup decision. I mean,
You mentioned Daniels just now, but we don't have Daniels. We have Richardson. Right.
But the team I have with my sister has that group. Right. Yes. And so, we have these two separate 4 QB rosters that are both really weird because you're trying to gather information and you're trying to get through that bye. you're trying to match up, you're trying to maintain flexibility in the sprint for the final week.
And I
I
think your
think those
point about
things are
the lack of injuries at the other positions is really. I mean, I think the whole thing gets there. If you can't make a move for the final 4 weeks, and you have to have different starters for week 17 figured out before week 14, so you also need to have the bye week fill into week 14, but also thinking 4 weeks ahead. That gets there. But your point about the skill players being healthy and not really needing the depth necessarily. It's not just that we don't need the contingent. You kind of mentioned the contingent plays. It's also that you at this time of year, usually we have tough flex decisions. And so we're also thinking, well, who are the guys who could not just in a contingent way, but be flex playable just because of how things kind of shift in the next couple weeks with their offenses? We need a couple different options. The way we're looking at it is like we have Jamison Williams and Jordan Addison on the bench, right? And it's like we want to be plugging guys in. We're having to bench every week. It's not likely that we pick up some random player. When you go look at the guys who are available in these leagues, there's not a lot of viable options even for like how this could break in a way that is favorable for these guys. Because the other thing that happens in these formats is every player dropped since week 11 locks for the season. So you can't get this like late season collusion where people drop players to help out somebody else they may know in the league or something like that has like the blind bidding money. So everything is locked. So anyone like there's some leagues where like Isaac Guerrero was cut and locked in week 11 or week 12 before he became a potential key pickup. And it's like, I mean, when you look at like how thinned out the waivers are, you're like, I mean, there's no one else to add but quarterbacks. I mean, the quarterbacks are the position where you may actually wind up finding something that is helpful. You mentioned the Levis thing. I wanted to ask you, you were talking about some of the different plays. What you thought of the Calvin Ridley play on 3rd and 5, I believe it was, right before the Westbrook Akine play that you mentioned was the 4th down. They ran Ridley on that wide receiver sprint out where they bring him from the left side of the formation behind the line of scrimmage across to the right flat. The Rams did this with Cooper Kupp in 2001 9 million times, and then every team has kind of adopted it since. At least that's in my mind where this came from. Bringing the wide receiver across behind the line of scrimmage and getting him open in the flat. There's usually like a play action, and then the quarterback rolls out and he has a little dump off. They did it, I believe, to the short side of the field. Levis maybe took a little bit too long to do it, but he got the dump off to Ridley in reasonable amount of time, and Ridley just sprinted. Like, you got to throttle down a little bit. He was completely uncovered, which happens on this play a lot because the player gets lost behind the line of scrimmage. It's the whole point of the play. They're supposed to catch and turn upfield. He catches the ball, barely gets 2 feet in, just runs straight out of bounds for a 2-yard gain, 3 yards short of the sticks. It's a 3rd and 5 play that's designed to catch the ball and get yak for the first down. There's a Jacksonville defender that runs over to him and is pointing at his helmet going, you got to think. And Ridley kind of bows his head in, a little bit of frustration with himself, I think. That was one of the, I don't know. I don't know why I was asking what you thought of that. It was one of the biggest bonehead plays I saw of the week. It's 3rd and 5, man. You got to get up. You have to slow yourself. You have to have some awareness. You're running behind the line of scrimmage and into the opposite flat horizontally for the whole play. You got to be aware that you're going to run out of field at some point. You got to slow down because you got to be able to get upfield. There's no point to running that play if you're going to just catch it, drag your feet in bounds, and go out of bounds 3 yards short of the sticks. They're like, why? What's the play design?
Yeah, the Titans have been struggling with a lot of things that I think gets back to preparation. You don't really want to be rooting for anybody. I mean, there's a storybook element for us watching. Obviously, the NFL is basically a drama, right? I mean, this is storytelling for people who like sports, and it's easy to see the people as characters as opposed to humans in their real lives. I try to remind myself about that from time to time when I'm thinking about these coaches who I believe probably should be let go and give someone else a shot and polish your skills. Maybe you get another chance and do a better job at it. Certainly I wouldn't want them like to look at my worst fantasy roster and be like, this guy should be fired from his job. But yeah, the Titans don't look very well prepared. when I saw that play, I'm like, well, maybe they'll throw a touchdown to someone else because Colin and I were also playing against Calvin Ridley. One of the things we were kind of thinking was that at least by starting Will Levis playing Calvin Ridley, we've got him a little bit covered. Now, obviously, Ridley did score more points than Levis, since Levis scored basically 0. That play that reminded me of, though, and the other thing I always have to remind myself is that the yellow line is not on the field for the players. When you're watching it at home, where the first down is very, very obvious.
He was 3 yards short of it.
Well, but the play that I'm going to reference was a little closer, where I think the most shocking play of the week for me, and you and I kind of, maybe it was even, mostly off the air, but we were trying to decide between Caleb Williams and Brock Purdy. So all these quarterback decisions that we have struggled with. We got this one right. We did end up switching to Purdy. Caleb Williams obviously coming off of 2 stronger fantasy performances. There's been a big difference since Shane Waldron was let go. I thought that the 49ers might be almost as much in crisis as the Bears. That's certainly not the way that game played out. There was a play in this game, Ben, where Caleb Williams deals with the rush, breaks free, scrambles, sprints forward, and you're thinking, okay, he's showing a lot of awareness now. He looks good with the ball in his hands. We're starting to get the scrambling ability. He is about a yard away from the first down, has open field in all directions in front of him, turns and looks at the guys chasing behind him, and then slides short of the first down despite he's already gotten past the guys who are behind him.
Didn't he kind of spin off a tackle, and he was kind of like, I felt like he maybe kind of spun off one tackle, but yeah, then everyone was behind him and he's short of the line, and he just like falls to the ground and gives himself up so he doesn't get caught from behind because he didn't really have momentum. But just dive forward. To your point, there's no one in front of you at this point. You don't need to slide. I feel like maybe he was coached this week. When I saw that play, I was like, this looks like this had to have been a coaching point. Don't take the hit that Trevor Lawrence took, basically. Don't even put yourself at risk. Don't do the late slides. I think they made that a point. Like, we don't want you getting a concussion late in your rookie year. I'm still with you 100%. I know exactly the play you're talking about. He just like sat down in front of and you're like, what are you doing? Go across the line.
I've never seen anything like that before, which also gave me the sense that Caleb Williams is not quite there yet, but I think he will. It is a concern, though, because the vast majority of these stars are stars right away. Josh Allen, someone who did take a little bit longer to develop. Well, certainly Caleb Williams has elite talent in so many different categories.
Yeah,
and we got some production from one Washington Husky in this game.
A couple touchdowns in this game. The for Roma Dunze you're referring to, the Caleb stuff, he's I guess I'm a little bit worried, but again, I've said this to you on the show this year. I didn't want to double count when I already decided that the coaching situation was horrible, and I basically decided that in the first month. That doesn't mean that you're never going to want to update your priors, but there's been nothing to tell me that I should update my priors. And since they fired Waldron, some things did get a little bit better, but then also now that they fired before firing Eberflus on Thanksgiving, you have the huge meltdown at the end of the game, which is you were just talking about the preparation thing with the Titans. That's a pure preparation thing. Like, how is that not something that teams do the 2-minute stuff every week? How is that not something? And I talked to you about this. We talked about it, I think, on a show, or I talked to you about it maybe off the air. My issue with it was that they burned 2 timeouts on that drive on dead balls. Clock is not running. The second one they burned. Now there was about 40 seconds left. There were just 2 plays after that when they did the whole debacle. And so when you burn that second one, you're like, okay, if you're planning on saving the third one for the field goal, which, going back to this Thanksgiving thing, replaying it all, is what they did. They let that clock run down because they wanted to save that third one. If you're doing that, then you know that in advance, we're going to save it for the field goal. Then you got to talk through the different scenarios. If you take a sack, if this happens, what happens? We got to be able to, you talk to your rookie quarterback, but none of that obviously happened. Caleb Williams is trying to figure it all out in real time, 3rd and long, clock's running down. He's trying to do all this mental stuff. What am I supposed to be doing on this play? he shouldn't have to be doing all of that on the field. It doesn't look great for him from a football IQ standpoint that he didn't immediately know it, because a lot of guys do. They just always know the football situations, and it made him look bad. But a lot of guys don't, man. Like, that's something that, like, Jared Goff got a lot of criticism for, and I think it took him some time in the NFL to be coached up enough to really, like, develop the football IQ in some of the situations, is my opinion, for a guy that...
Then I saw that Aaron Rodgers managed to finally break his streak of games under 300 passing yards, and he felt like that was a good time to point out that football IQ has fallen. It's like, I'm finally
Aaron
back
Rodgers
up to 300
is pointing
yards.
that out. Yeah.
I have credibility again.
Yeah.
Let's point out other people's football IQ.
Right. So you have the mishaps at the end of that game. Then Eberflus gets fired, and then this week in San Francisco, to your point, they start horribly again. They're down 24-0 at half. I think the way that I wrote this up is, so because I talked to you when we talked about this game, I was thinking maybe we'd get an interim head coach like bump, and the Bears would play a little bit better. And I was telling you, sometimes it feels like the guys underneath the coach see some of the flaws, but maybe the guy at the top is a little stubborn to implement those things because it wasn't his idea or something. But then he gets removed. The interim coach comes in and goes, look, these are the three things that really need to be changed. I can see it from my underling position, and now that I'm in power, I'm going to make these changes. And you sometimes see a big bump, and you're like, yeah, the interim coach is finding a lot of success just by eliminating,
a big breath of fresh air.
Right.
That can really loosen guys up. Sometimes the interim coach is kind of the fire up guy, and so he's the one that the players wanted to play hard for anyway. And I mean, there are a variety of reasons,
a variety of things,
that you can get a really enthusiastic performance in the aftermath of a move like this.
But the other thing that is true, and people do mention when it doesn't go great, is everything they've done through the offseason program and the weekly preparation all year has been under that old coach. And if your head coach and your offensive coordinator were both so bad that they both got fired, what was the install like of the whole offense in the offseason? What was the design? Week one, they were using Gerald Everett and Travis Homer a bunch because Shane Waldron had coached him in Seattle. I mean, it's just a joke. They end up firing these guys. Like, throughout the season, he leans away from those guys. But then, I mean, ultimately he gets fired. They're making adjustments in season. That's hard to do. Eberflus gets fired. The thing that I wrote this week is, yeah, those things do happen sometimes. The interim coach bumps do happen, but sometimes it can probably just be so dysfunctional from a top-down hierarchy perspective structurally of the whole coaching staff that even removing, well, or not even, it just creates a situation where it's almost like, I mean, firing the guys didn't fix anything. It didn't. Who's going to make the changes? Who in the whole organization is going to be able to fix everything? They've had some positives. They were able to put up some decent games since Waldron got fired. A decent amount of that seemed to be just like throwing more aggressively, and maybe just calling it some different route combinations or something that was able to let guys like Keenan Allen find space, which he seemed to not be able to under Waldron for whatever reason. Again, I'm chalking that up to like route combinations and things like that. But again, the playbook didn't change. So it's what the calls are in which situations. You wonder if maybe they're asking the players what what plays they're comfortable running, and maybe there's some input that way. But I look at this now and I'm like, okay, Eberflus also gets fired, and we're in a situation where this team did not look prepared at all. They looked like a team that didn't know how to prepare for an NFL game, and they're down 24-0 at the half again for the second straight week. And so I don't think there's even enough good coaches in the room, is sort of the idea. When you have a bad head coach that probably should have been let go, and you retained him last year, and then he hires the wrong offensive coordinator, it's a sign of organizational dysfunction that probably the other hires weren't strong either. We just don't know their names as well. Thomas Brown's this guy that's now the head coach, interim head coach, but the different positional coaches and all these things maybe aren't all the things you just described. The fire up guy or the tactical guy that I was saying is, here's the three things we need to fix. They don't have answers. It just seems to me. So then all of this gets back to Caleb Williams. I think it's a bad coaching job from day one. I think, the fact that those guys got fired proves that. I think that means that you probably have to assume that the offense was pretty flawed from the preseason, and that some of the defenses that they're playing are seeing stuff on film. Here's some tendencies. Here's some things. We're going to be able to defend this pretty easily. We're going to be able to cause problems for this rookie quarterback. And the offense isn't having answers for that. Now you've fired the coaches, and the other coaches that are taking over those positions, they don't have answers. I don't want to hold that against the rookie QB. It could still be a problem. It reminds me a lot of Trevor Lawrence's rookie year under Urban Meyer, and people said he was going to be horrible, and he hasn't necessarily been great. There still has been a lack of ceiling there for a number 1 overall pick, but he also was quite a bit better starting right away in year 2, that it wasn't such a dysfunctional situation.
And that comp, I think, is a really strong one. You'd like to think as a Caleb Williams fantasy manager that the additional rushing will take Lawrence's post-Meyer level and make it pretty fantasy relevant. My concern would just be that, even some of those bumps with Lawrence seem unsustainable in that, you think about where they are right now, he's dealt with a lot of injuries, but when he was knocked out of the game in week 13, Mac Jones was an improvement. Now, that's a Trevor Lawrence who was already playing injured even before he gets knocked out. We know that Baker Mayfield, for example, played a full season pretty badly injured for the Browns, still is very frustrated that instead of sticking with him, they kind of blamed him for things where he's like, this is a pretty good performance for an injured QB. And yeah, he's probably not a guy who's going to take you to a Super Bowl, but Baker Mayfield is a viable NFL starter. I think if you
certainly would have been in a lot better position organizationally if they would have stuck with Baker Mayfield instead of trading a bunch of first-round picks to give him a ton of guaranteed money to convicted assault offender.
Well,
I said convicted. Sorry,
recently,
alleged. I don't think you can say convicted. Alleged. Anyway.
Yeah, the Browns had built such incredible roster depth and pick depth, future assets. You give Baker Mayfield the most talented team in the NFL, which is where the Browns were going at that point. The Browns would be pretty interesting. Baker Mayfield is awesome. Yeah, you work back through it, and I think that if you drafted Caleb Williams in Dynasty, if you drafted him this year and redraft or thinking about next year, having Baker Mayfield and Trevor Lawrence, who again also number 1 overall picks, as the guys that he ends up being most similar to, that's going to be extremely frustrating. It actually might be a pretty good outcome from where he is now.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I think every player is unique. It would be my case. Trevor Lawrence, the point that I would make with that comp is year 1, 2% TD rate, year 2, 4.3%, more than doubles it. Year 1, 2.8% pick rate, year 2, 1.4%, cuts it in half, right? Year 1, 59.6% completion percentage, year 2, 66.3%, adds 6+ percentage points to his completion percentage. That made his AYA go from 5.2 to 7.3, over 2 yards up. It's been 6.8 and 6.9 in the 2 years since. So he's actually regressed since that year 2, which was his best season. That's the part where I'm like, hopefully Caleb Williams can be different than the rest of what Trevor Lawrence's story has become, and hopefully Trevor Lawrence can bounce back too, right? Like all these things, we want quarterbacks to be good in the NFL. I thought Trevor Lawrence had the room to bounce back this year after a tough year 3. He had an even tougher year 4 in a lot of ways. But the gap from year 1 to year 2 for him statistically striking across the board. And so that's something where I don't want to get too mired down in Caleb's specific numbers. And I understand this feels like cherry picking, and people will say, well, all the other quarterbacks, the sample of players that have those numbers. I would argue that when we do these cohorts and these, sample sizes, we do need to adjust for these types of circumstances that dramatically affect what they're able to do on the field. I was arguing that for Trevor Lawrence going into year 2 as well, because the Urban Meyer stuff was so clearly and blatantly dysfunction the whole year. It's so hard to succeed in that type of an environment for a young player, especially. I want to give Caleb Williams the room to be something entirely different next year. And I think we've seen enough flashes that it's not like, his rookie year hasn't been as bad as Lawrence's, for example. His bar is now a little bit higher, I think, because Lawrence led the NFL in interceptions that year. Williams has had some issues.
I think we have to make sure we're adjusting both ways, though, in that Caleb Williams is surrounded by DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, Roma Dunze, and Cole Kmet. Cole Kmet they don't even use at this point, but he might have the most talented receiving core in the entire NFL as he's having these struggles.
That's true. That's a very good point. It's a very good point. There's
One of the things that jumps to mind for me as you are kind of going through some of that, and as we're discussing like some of these vast differences with coaching, that I'm interested to sort of get your take on is the situation now with the Vikings, where they ended up blowing out the Falcons at the end of their game, but they've had a lot of close wins again, as they did a couple of years ago. You have the Kansas City Chiefs, who are now being referred to as one of the most annoying teams ever because they're coming off of the 2 Super Bowl victories, and they seem to win by magic, incredible good luck every week. We know that winning close games is certainly not nearly as good an indicator of future success as winning blowouts. At the same time, we've emphasized a lot this year just how few possessions there are in NFL games, and how things like when teams, for example, the Miami Dolphins, have a really strong understanding of game situation, game tactics, how to maximize handling specific situations that come up very frequently. You mentioned the timeouts in that Chicago Bears game. There were like 3 different instances this past week where I'm watching a situation where a team simply doesn't get a play call in when they're down in the red zone and take a timeout in the second half that they are going to need as the game expires. You have to be better prepared in terms of the offensive play caller to get those plays in, to understand what your team does well, to understand what you need in that situation, and have practiced the decision making and simply the specific plays that you're going to run at the highest leverage moments in the game, so that you don't have to call a timeout and then decide what play you want to run when you are on a 3rd and medium in the red zone. Because converting there is important, but you also have to maintain as much flexibility to manage the late game situation. The teams that don't consistently make those mistakes are going to be able to outperform across the board. In many cases, you would expect that to have these cascade effects where they're winning by some larger margins, but you're not always dealing with situations where your team is talented enough to blow other teams out. And so my question would be, is this similar to what we've discussed with fantasy analysis of players, where the overall trend or the overall predictiveness or a certain stat or a certain series of stats, as you look at them in concert, can be very misleading when you get down to the individual player level, and that you have to be willing to analyze each player individually to understand where they are and what things about their profile are likely to play up or play down based on where they are in their career, where they are in their team situation, how lucky or unlucky they were the year before, all of those types of things. Or is it a situation where teams like the Vikings and the Chiefs, teams that appear to be very well coached, even though Andy Reid does have a reputation for some game management mistakes, you could make the case that a few of these games they probably could have won by more if you make some different decisions. But is it a little bit unfair to be criticizing well-coached teams for winning close games? Now, certainly the case that like the Vikings are probably not as good as the Detroit Lions, for example. The Chiefs are probably not as good as they have been in the past. But there's going to be, my thought would be that, yeah, this does reveal some weaknesses. It also reveals some strengths that you can't magically put into a team, because you can't suddenly make a team be really well coached and really well prepared. If you're the Chiefs or the Vikings, you might get some players back who make a big difference. And suddenly you now have the talent to build on what you've done and what you have at some key positions, at, whether that is QB, head coach, coordinator. But as these teams are preparing, it's going to be the entire coaching staff. There's so much to do to get ready for an NFL game. And in some ways, I'm just always much more mind boggled that teams mostly manage things correctly than when you actually do see them make mistakes.
You were just hitting on the point that I've referred to as misapplying the aggregate to the specific a decent amount, and wrote a piece at the newsletter in early August titled that misapplying the aggregate to the specific. I completely, like you were sort of asking as you were going through that, my take on that. I think I have a very strong opinion on that. It's grown much, much stronger. I do think there are over the years, I do think there are aggregate analyses that can be useful and should be used. I think the fantasy football industry massively overvalues aggregate research because everything is small samples. Every player is unique individually. I mean, I'll give an example of where I did this. I love the targets per out run stuff, and I was out on Brian Thomas because he didn't earn enough target volume in any of his 3 college seasons and wasn't very efficient in the first 2 years. And really all we had was the massive after the target efficiency in year 3. And in the aggregate, I do strongly believe that you need to show a target earning profile that's more impressive than Brian Thomas's to matter. But his situation is one in the specific where the fact that he scored 17 touchdowns last year said something about who this player is. The fact that he was so efficient after the target said something about who this player is that was unique to any other player who had his type of target earning profile. You said it on the shows. When you're scoring a touchdown from 80 yards away, you don't get more targets, right? Like if every time the ball's thrown to you, you score, you're not going to earn as much volume necessarily because they are going to have to run some other plays and some things at times. It changes the
And Blake
way
Neighbors, it turns out, is pretty good. Is going to draw some targets himself.
There's other elements to that too, because he, was lower in target earning, and then he actually did move forward when Kayshon Boutte left, and then, but no, I mean, you're right. I mean, and it made me even wonder if maybe Kayshon Boutte's better than we think, because that's a guy who part of his profile is that it got worse as those guys came on board, but we now know those guys were studs, young underclassmen, 2 studs that were. LSU had some good players. It's like they usually do, it seems like. But the point is, the way that the aggregate research is always used, Sean, is to look at these like outlier cases and then say, and this is what I did with Brian Thomas, and it's why he's the example that popped in my head. I have a mental block with anyone with this type of target earning profile that they can't succeed, except he's an edge case because the efficiency was so elite that it actually was the one where you can't box him into the targets per route run research. And that's what all you're doing. Now, the targets per route run research it broadly is going to be helpful for most players that don't have this extreme other element or something, but we always look at the extremes, right? And then people say, okay, this cohort is really good, and we're going to put in a player that doesn't belong there in there because I'm going to set some arbitrary endpoints and add, some not good player into that group, and then say, I feel like it happened with Michael Pittman a little bit. Like Michael Pittman's elite. He's in with all these other elite players. I'm like, yeah, but no, all those other players are elite, and Michael Pittman actually isn't for these reasons or whatever. I don't know why Michael Pittman's the first name that came to my mind, but he's whatever, a player that I think of as like a second tier player and not in that elite group, but people at times wanted to place him there, I guess. The point is, in football, we have small samples all the way down, and we have this multivariability element that we've talked about a million times, but the ways that stats are formulated, we're just talking about with Caleb Williams, for example, you're getting influenced by the coaching, you're getting influenced by the other players. You made a great counterpoint about the receivers on his team and how different that is than the other rookie quarterbacks that we were talking about, and that is very different. It's not to say that the aggregate can't inform us, but that it's way too heavily relied upon. Our whole industry is built on these aggregate analyses and then saying that everything has to be based on like stats. And I start sounding like a film bro, which in the early days in RotoViz, when I was there, it was a stats versus film thing on Twitter constantly. And I was out there on the Twitter streets arguing that you can't do all your fantasy analysis based on film. You have to do it based on stats. I do think when you have an understanding of the stats and you have an understanding of how not to overweight, the models and the different things, and yet also are willing to try to find some room in that gray area. The way that I've described it a lot, Sean, is we love to talk about the R squared of various stats, and the R squared only can get up to whatever 0.6. which means that there's 40% unexplained variance. And that unexplained variance matters. We wind up talking about players where the unexplained variance is like very clear. Like Brian Thomas is the reason that I can't build a targets per out run model that's going to be perfect. He's in the unexplained variance. He's the guy that is the outlier. And you can see that when you look at the rest of his receiving profile. And yet I fell into that mistake. And a lot of analysts fall into this mistake where rather than try to wade into the unexplained variance and do a better job of understanding what models and what data are trying to help you with, because they are a tool. Because what everyone says is you can't change it. That's bias. You're applying bias to the model. You're biasing this, you're biasing that. But the truth is you can. I mean, the really good data scientists do a thing called data cleaning, I believe it is. I mean, I don't know. I remember taking a data science class years ago just to try to understand the basics of it. But like they literally teach you in these classes, like you have to sometimes fill in missing data with your best assumption. That's what I'm talking about doing. It's actually considered good process from a data science perspective when done carefully and necessarily as the data sample is incomplete. I would argue all football data samples are incomplete, but also that everyone's really rigid in saying you can't insert your player biases into it. You have to look at the data exactly as it is, and they're unwilling to do this data cleaning. It is specifically what it is, and yet all we have is small samples, right? Like everything is, we talked about with Puka Nacua this year, and he looks awesome. But like his rookie year, people wanted to say, well, imagine what he does in year 2. And I was like, well, he just had the best rookie year of all time. Like you can't really just say, I'm going to apply a year 2 percentage bump from the best rookie year of all time. Year 2 players typically are 10, 15% better or something like that. Do you do that when the guy scores as many points as he did as a rookie, or do you sort of hope that he just backs that up and is? And anyway, if he stayed healthy, he may have scored even more points. But every player is unique, is the point that I'm trying to drive home, Sean. There's, I mean, all sorts of. We talk about the different types of players at different positions, different types of wide receivers. For years, slot receivers didn't have ceiling. And then like Wes Welker was an absolute superstar for a while with the Patriots because he could catch so many passes. And then you have Cooper Kupp have the best wide receiver season ever. And he's a de facto, he's not a slot receiver. He's better on the outside even. Moves around a bunch within that offense. But low ADOT guy who generates a ton of explosive plays after the catch and within the context of that offense. And then Amon-Ra St. Brown is the other example I wanted to throw in there. And it's like, okay, in this archetype, yeah, it's harder to be that dominant. But you can. It's obviously possible. And you don't just make I'm not going to draft that type of player with the low ADOT sweeping claim without analyzing the individual situations. Anyway, I'm off on a huge tangent, but I do think that's a very
Ben,
important point.
I want to bring you back here to my question. And as I set that up, I want to note that I do think the statistical analysis, when done from a lot of different angles and done globally, is incredibly effective. And that's certainly what we've seen with all of these fantastic analysts who...
Oh, I'm certainly not denying that.
Right. Who have moved the industry so far forward in the last 5 years. I think one of the reasons,
including not to brag, Sean, but including myself, like I do the statistical analysis from a lot of different angles as well. I'm not saying that you shouldn't.
Right. The thing that I think made ADP so exploitable this year is that there was potentially an environment where people got caught up in this idea of this is the best stat or that is the best stat, which goes back to kind of what you were saying, where if players don't fit into that, but are actually still fantastic, then you end up getting them at a huge discount. And it's this is the best stat analysis that in most, or at least in many cases, is opening up all of these really exploitable areas again after, my sense of the industry is that these huge ADP inefficiencies had been closing over the previous decade. Well, let's look at these teams. You have the Vikings, you have Obviously, the Chiefs, who are so controversial right now. Ben, the Chiefs have defeated the Ravens, the Bengals, the 49ers, the Buccaneers, who are kind of a weird team where they're probably kind of good. They've got some decent wins. They've beaten the Detroit Lions. Uh, but their resume also bolstered a bit by playing in the NFC South. They've beaten the Broncos. They have twice defeated the Chargers, who are 8-3 against everybody else. Their lone loss is to the Buffalo Bills. And yet, because a lot of these games have been close, people are frustrated by the fact that they've got these close victories. I think that sometimes that spills over to the idea that the Chiefs aren't even good, which that case is probably hard to make and be correct. I have to say that the Chiefs have not been fun to watch. We got another play this week where Xavier Worthy would have had a walk-in touchdown, but as he's trying to throw the pass, Patrick Mahomes is contacted and so can't get the ball out there. This was a game, and this was kind of a fun debate that Colin and I were having on overtime. This was a week where Josh Allen broke everything and lost. It was a week where Patrick Mahomes, again, did relatively little and won. But when you look a little bit deeper, and again, in terms of how good the Chiefs are, this is a massive problem. But Patrick Mahomes looked like he was dealing with the same type of pressure that he got in their Buccaneers blowout Super Bowl loss. He managed to fight through it and lead the Chiefs to yet another victory. And I think it becomes, a little bit more controversial when the kicker kicks the ball off the upright. But the fact of the matter is that the Chiefs have set that up in a way where that kick is going to go in almost every time. Not after it hits the upright, but just generally speaking, the kicks from that distance are going to be extremely, extremely.
But it was weird that they kneeled twice with 1 minute and 11 seconds left and a timeout from the 11-yard line to back up to the 13 and kick a 30-yarder. I thought that was weird. Even if the kicker likes the right hash mark. I mean, it ultimately became a thing where if they're a yard further back, that does miss because he kicks at such an angle and it hits the far upright.
Every yard matters.
Yeah, you've said that for years.
Dan Campbell was like, we're going to go on 4th down and get closer.
Right.
And run out the clock.
Crazy. Yeah, no, I mean, somewhere when you asked the initial question, you were commenting sort of on that ignorant specific stuff. And I apologize if I went off on the completely wrong tangent, but
no, I like that. I want to know what you think of the Vikings and the Chiefs.
Well, the Chiefs in particular, they relate back to that point. There's so obviously a situation that we cannot analyze as apples to apples with any other situation. We know now over the last several years that they've shown, I believe, at least, maybe it's not really factual, but I'll say I believe my analysis of the situation has been 4 years that they sort of slow play the regular season. They understand that the Super Bowls are not won in November and December and October, especially. But the fact that they've been able to win all these close games puts them on a weird trajectory where, in my opinion, had they lost some of those games, they would have had to pull out some more stops. Their backs would have been against the wall a little bit. No one's been able to really put their backs against the wall too much. They actually did play a pretty good game against the Bills in their one loss. Some of the other games, it seems like they're toying with their food a little bit relative to what they can actually be. I'm not saying they don't have legitimate problems, but this time last year, Sean, everyone was saying that Kansas City Chiefs were done. I remember Kansas City Chiefs fans saying at this time last year, I'm not going to name names, but I remember a very specific tweet. This is the trade-off of being a Kansas City Chiefs fan and all the joy that's happened. I just have to accept this year for what it is. Like, it's just not this is the bad year we have to deal with. They went on to win the Super Bowl in that season where that was sent in a December, and like about this time, about week 15, that was the
turns out the 12-1 season is the bad season because they're unwatchable.
Right. They're 12-1 and unwatchable. My point is they've done this before and they've shown us an ability to actually turn it on and to have saved things and to essentially understand this concept of not wanting to put things on tape, understand that football is a cyclical game. The teams are going to prepare them or for them as a result of things. They're going to get Hollywood Brown back. I still think if you think like this Chiefs team is not good enough to win the Super Bowl, you're crazy. I still think they're very clearly one of the favorites. Are they going to win it? I don't know. They're probably not quite as dominant as they've been. Like, I do think there are some concerns here, but I think they're way better than what these one-score games reflects. And the fact that they keep winning is actually, it's a living, breathing evolution of a season. It's actually part of the problem that they're going to keep playing this way because they're 12-1. They don't have any reason to really try, again, to pull out stops. I think they're holding things back is essentially what I'm arguing. And they do try to pull those things out at certain times. They'll also, they'll get Hollywood Brown back. They'll get some of those things. They got Pacheco back recently. It will be interesting to see the way the rest of their season goes, but especially their regular season as far as fantasy matters. But I don't think, they're even like that interesting. that's why I went into the other conversation. Like, I think there's nothing I can say other than they're a very unique team right now. And they will play up when they have to play up. That's what I think. I don't think any team's going to come in and blow them out, right? At any point. The Bills had to play a really perfect game to beat them. They ended up beating them by 9. Some of that came down to every game's a game of possessions. They were up by 2. They got a late touchdown. They pushed it to 9. The Chiefs just did not have enough time to get 2 more scores at that point. But Mahomes and company they were playing okay as well. It was a close game. It was mostly a 2-point game in the whole second half. The Bills scored to make it 9. The Chiefs scored back to make it 2 again. The Bills scored back to make it 9, and that was the end of it. Bills made it a 2-point game with the last play of the first half, a field goal. It was Chiefs lead going into halftime before the Bills were able to get a field goal right before half. Close game the whole way through. Game of possessions. That's the way football is sometimes. That's their only loss. They certainly didn't get blown out or beat hard, bad in that game. They've lost to the Bills in the regular season before and gone on to beat them in the playoffs. Like, I don't think anyone in Buffalo thinks that they have the Chiefs number because they beat them by 9 this regular season. They eventually deserve to lose one of these games, but they continue to pull them out. And that's what happens in one-score games. They can run your way sometimes.
Are we in the same category with Mike Tomlin and the Steelers? A couple weeks ago, I made the controversial statement that the Steelers were scarier than the Ravens and the Bills. Since then, the Ravens have continued to demonstrate that they don't have a very good defense in 2024. The Bills this week demonstrated that they don't. The Steelers have Russell Wilson at quarterback, but they're getting some things done even this week without George Pickens. Jaylen Warren, for anybody who has gotten through with him, has him in Dynasty, has him on some of your best ball teams that got through in spite of him, he looks ready to really take off.
Yeah, it was weird, though, because he first did that 3 weeks ago, and he played a lot more, and he was like the hot hand. And then the next week, they leaned back hard into Najee by, like, overall touches and snap share. And Najee looked decent, and that was 2 weeks ago. And then this past week, we got the same as 3 weeks ago, where Najee didn't look good early, and Jaylen Warren clearly looked better, and then they let Warren play quite a bit more as a result. That's a weird one to me. I don't think it's the same thing. I think whatever Tomlin does is probably pretty unique as well, that it's more like on the motivational side. It's more on, some of the secret sauce stuff. I don't necessarily think I don't get the impression Andy Reid has that type of impact. He's had some blunders, I think, at times, and his teams don't always necessarily maximize every edge. And they've lost because of it at times in regular seasons in the past. I just feel like they're running hot this year. Like, I just think it's positive variance for the Chiefs. I don't think they're necessary. And then you also have one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time, if not the greatest quarterback of all time. That's going to clearly help you in late game situations. That when you get the ball, you're going to score. And when they get the ball, they're going to have a chance to not score, whoever your opponent is.
Well, I think there are two very different but complementary things that go on when we're talking about these teams that sometimes don't even appear that talented, that are just consistently successful. And the one is the game management and the game tactics and all those types of things. But then separately, you just have the overall competence that suffuses your entire organization. And I think both the Chiefs and the Steelers have that in a way that probably the Bengals don't. But maybe the Bengals have just been extremely unlucky. You do have situations in which your team has horrible stretches of injury luck as well. And you can certainly point to some key injuries for the Bengals over the last 5 years, where if those injuries don't happen, then maybe they look like a dynasty themselves. The Steelers are an organization where the overall roster talent, even if it's not concentrated on the flashy positions, and then the overall coaching talent, even if it's not concentrated on a head coach being a coordinator, and then the overall organizational competency stretching all the way through ownership, is simply going to give them advantages in football games where key blunders so often decide the outcome.
Right. But I do think they are overperforming. I mean, they're all very interesting. The way that I would describe, you asked me about the Chiefs and the Vikings. The way I describe the Chiefs and the way that I am describing them is they're 12-1, and their results don't suggest that they should be 12-1. If you look at a Pythagorean formula, Pythagorean Pat or whatever formula, you're going to find out that their expected win-loss is quite a bit lower. And yet, I mean, I don't think they're better than 12-1, but I definitely think they're better than their expected win-loss is the case that I'm making. That they're holding back a level of play beyond what they are because they have a multi-year established trend of winning Super Bowls and knowing that they need to be able to play multiple games in January and have things that teams have not game planned for in those games. The Vikings, to me, are the opposite of that, where they're 11-2. They're very similar to a couple years ago. I think Kevin O'Connell helps them win by smart game planning and smart decision-making and those things. But I also think Sam Darnold's not a very reliable option at quarterback when you get into playoff situations and you get against much tougher defenses. And I do think they're going to have a hard time living up to this. And I would actually put them probably closer to whatever their expected win-loss is, which I would assume is a little bit lower, although they do a better job of maximizing points in games. They have some blowout wins that the Chiefs don't have necessarily, but they do have some close wins as well. Over the last 5 weeks, they beat the Jags by 5. They beat the Bears by 3 in overtime. They beat the Cardinals by 1 in that come-from-behind win. Beat the Titans by 10, which isn't even like a massive blowout for the Titans. So they've had some close games even just recently. But yeah, I mean, they're a good team. I think they're a good team. They're very similar to when we talked about them in 2022. I remember talking about, like, as Vikings fans, you shouldn't, because people were saying the Vikings were frauds in 2022. And I was saying you shouldn't be upset about that. Yeah, your team's maybe not as good as their win-loss record, but you should be excited that your win-loss record is as good, puts you in great position. I feel the same way about this year's Vikings, frankly. I'm not saying that they're fraud and they're frauds, and again, their point differential is a lot stronger this year than that team. But I do think the scenarios are similar, where they're getting results that are a little bit above their head, probably should have taken 1 or 2 additional losses. And I think that's the same for the Steelers. Mike Tomlin, I think, elevates, but they're also running favorably. Does that make? I mean, I think both of those teams have win-loss records that are better than I think they truly are, and the Chiefs too, because 12-1 is just an absurd number. But I think the Chiefs have the ability to play better than they are, and like turn it on. I think they're holding back, and they're still 12-1, which is something that I don't think people actually put together. I guess they're like, well, the Chiefs just aren't that good anymore. And I'm like, yeah, you said this last year. I mean, we've heard this before about the Chiefs.
And if you've watched all the games, then you have a real potential to let your own biases and the individual plays that stuck out to you as they happened and then stuck in your mind for the long term because they stuck out to you so much when they happened, to create a misleading environment for you. If you haven't watched the games, then you don't necessarily have the sense of this contrast between, say, Jaden Daniels, who has 2 miracle long touchdowns that almost certainly would never happen again, versus Xavier Worthy having lost like a full season's worth of huge plays that if you run the season again, this is going to be an outcome that is almost impossible to replicate. If you have Xavier Worthy scoring some of those, then the Chiefs scoring looks better, but also the perception is better because their offense is perceived to be more dynamic. In terms of the actual football situation, they have massive problems with their pass blocking right now. So that could certainly be an issue for them as we go forward.